Today, if you go to Toronto, you'll get the finest Indian restaurants anywhere in the world. When I moved to Canada, there were 500 Indians in Toronto. Today, there are 500,000 Indians in Toronto. When you arrive in Toronto, you're more likely to see an Indian than you are to see a Caucasian. If you shout out in the Toronto airport, "Mr. Singh," you're probably going to have 20 or 30 look back and say, "Did you call me?" If you say John, you'll have to come to Oklahoma Christian University to call the president and find a couple of Mr. Johns out here. People ask me, why do Indians die young? I say, because he's preparing the chefs out there for the marriage supper of the Lamb. We're getting up there for all the culinary delights. I can't help but think of a story of a gathering in an English club where there was a Japanese gentleman sitting at a table looking rather nervous. And the Englishman walked in and seeing him, figured he might want to instruct him on English etiquette before the meal began. So the man sat there nervously, and the Englishman picked up the knife and said, "This be knifey." And he picked up the fork and said, "And this be forky. And this be spoony. And this be platey." And the Japanese gentleman just kept nodding very courteously. After the preliminaries were over, much to the shock of the English gentleman, the Japanese was the keynote speaker. And he got up and delivered his talk in flawless English. And he went and sat down and looked at the Englishman and said, "You likey speechy?" As a bagpiper, I play many gigs. Recently, I was asked by a funeral director to play at a graveside service for a homeless man. He had no family or friends, so the service was to be at a pauper cemetery in the Kentucky backcountry. As I was not familiar with the backwoods, I got lost. I finally arrived an hour late and saw the funeral guy had evidently gone, and the hearse was nowhere in sight. There were only the diggers and crew left, and they were eating lunch. I felt bad and apologized to the men for being late. I went to the side of the grave and looked down, and the vault lid was already in place. I didn't know what else to do, so I started to play. The workers put down their lunches and began to gather round. I played out my heart and soul for this man with no family and friends. I played like I'd never played before for this homeless man. And as I played Amazing Grace, the workers began to weep. They wept. I wept. We all wept together. When I finished, I packed up my bagpipes and started my car. Though my head hung low, my heart was full. As I opened the door to my car, I heard one of the workers say, "Never seen nothing like that before, and I've been putting in septic tanks for 20 years. For the first time I heard N.T. Wright was his return visit to a venue in Vancouver, a church in Vancouver. And I'll never forget his opening line. He's a great scholar, as you know. And he said, it's more appropriate for me to be speaking today after looking at the marquee outside. He said, a few years ago when I came here, on the marquee it said, as I was coming to speak, it said, "Who is the King of Glory? N.T. Wright." He said, I was horrified. They put my name about the subject. He said, today it was more appropriate. It said, "The Return of the Prodigal, N.T. Wright." So after you've heard from the King of Glory and the Return of the Prodigal, I don't know what's left but the guys who was looking after the pigs, I guess, and hired the prodigal child who returned home.
Many years ago, I was doing a graduate level course in philosophy by a man who got PhDs the way you and I would get a jug of milk. I think he had about 3 doctorates and 7 or 8 degrees, and a very, very confidently arrogant man. He was so intimidating in the classroom that nobody ever dare say a word. You were not even sure you'd get your name right if he asked you to give him your name. So nobody said anything. By the 3rd or 4th day, he realized nobody was going to interact in this class, so he changed the rules of the course. He made it this. He said the grade is going to be divided this way. 50% for the answers you give me in the examination I give you at the end of the term, and 50% for the questions you ask me in class during the course of the term. That finished it. I was ready to be buried, pronounce the last rites, and leave. So I spent half the night in bed thinking up some extraordinary question that would wow this man and that would at least guarantee me 50% of the grade. Well, most of us spent so much time thinking up questions, we really didn't spend enough time preparing for the answers we were going to have to give him. And when I looked at that examination paper, I nearly died. I said, that's it. This is finished. I'm going to make an absolute fool. I sat there and openly prayed. I said, Lord, I really need you. But every time I opened my eyes, the fellow on my right kept writing away. He didn't stop. I said, something is wrong. This fellow is working away like just a train tearing down the tracks, going on and on, asking for more sheets of paper and going on and on. You see, he made one fundamental mistake. He had emotionally not graduated from junior high yet, where you did what you call euphemistically padding. You know what padding is, where you write everything that you think is remotely connected with the subject on hand. And somewhere in the volume of words, you are sure you will hint in the direction of the answer. Well, the day we got our answer papers back, I will never forget. It happens to be one of the funniest one-lines I have ever read. Only I had to wait to go back to the apartment before I could half die with laughter, because it wasn't very polite to laugh when I saw it. I asked him if I could see his grade, and so I said, do you mind if I see what he said, I don't understand what he said here. There was one statement made in red ink, and this is what the professor said. This is not right. This is not even wrong. This is not right. This is not even wrong. You see, if anybody says something, you can react two ways. You can say this is right, or you can say this is wrong. But if anybody has said something purely nonsensical, then it does not even rise to the dignity of an error.
You know, the story is told of an Indian Punjabi farmer who was talking to a Texan. Texans are known to think large. And so this Texan was talking to the Punjabi farmer, and he said, Mr. Singh, how big is your farm in Punjab? And the man said, if you look about 25 yards ahead, you see that lamppost? Yeah, my farm is about that long and that wide. He said, you know, Mr. Singh, how big my ranch is in Texas? If you got into my car at sundown, at sunrise every day and kept driving and driving and driving and driving and driving, somewhere around mid-morning or midday, you will reach the end of my property line. And the Punjabi man said, I know exactly what you mean. I used to have a car just like that. So across these fault lines of language and culture, it's very easy to miss the point.
I remember when I was in my mid-20s preaching in Vietnam. And I was preaching in the city of Dalat, up in the highlands there, and in a little village where there were tribal people. They were mostly illiterate. And I recall going through an interpreter, trying to preach to them the most basic truths. Most of them didn't have any teeth in their mouths, and they looked like they came from a completely different world to mine. But there they sat night after night, packed to capacity. And I was talking about creation one day, and I gave them this simple little illustration. I'm sure you're familiar with it. But it's run something like this, about a fellow who sat under a nut tree once, and pretending to be quite the master of engineering skills and structural engineering and so on. He said, you know, God, you really are not very smart. When I think of the way you've made this world, a huge tree holding little nuts, and a small plant holding huge watermelons, it just doesn't add up. A big tree, small nuts, small plant, huge watermelon. And as he waxed eloquent against God's inability to do things reasonably, suddenly a little nut fell and hit him on his head, and he said, thank God that wasn't a watermelon. You know what I like about that? A group of villagers can sit there and laugh meaningfully because they do not have the same problem we do, where we have educated ourselves into imbecility.